Ringo's drumsticks hit the floor with a crash that echoed through the Royal Albert Hall. As 5,000 faces turned to stare, the other three Beatles shared a look of pure terror. The secret they'd hidden for months was about to explode. September 18, 1963. The Royal Albert Hall stood like a crown jewel in London's evening mist. Inside, the Beatles prepared for what should have been their greatest triumph yet, their first performance at Britain's most prestigious venue. But backstage, Ringo Starr sat alone in his dressing room, holding a letter that changed everything. The letter had arrived that morning, delivered by a man who disappeared before anyone could question him. Inside, a single photograph and 7 words: "Play tonight, and everyone sees this picture." The photograph showed Ringo, but not the Ringo the world knew. This was Richard Starkey from 6 months ago, before he was officially a Beatle, in a hospital bed, surrounded by medical equipment, his body broken in ways the public never knew, and standing next to him, the man he'd replaced, Pete Best, the original Beatles drummer, holding Ringo's hand. What the photograph revealed would destroy the carefully crafted Beatles mythology. You see, the world had been told a simple story. Pete Best was fired. Ringo was hired. The Beatles exploded into stardom. Clean, simple, a business decision. But the photograph proved something different, something that would shatter the band's image forever. Ringo hadn't replaced Pete. Pete had saved Ringo's life. 6 months earlier, Richard Starkey had been dying, not metaphorically, literally. A violent attack outside a Liverpool club had left him with internal bleeding, a punctured lung, and doctors who gave him a 20% chance of survival. He needed surgery, expensive surgery, surgery that a drummer playing for pennies could never afford. Pete Best paid for it. But here's what made this secret so dangerous. Pete didn't just pay for the surgery. He gave up his position in the Beatles to do it. The fictional promoter, Daniel Morrison, had made the band an ultimatum: tour Germany immediately or lose their record deal. Pete stayed with Ringo through 3 surgeries. He missed the tour. John, Paul, and George had no choice but to replace him. By the time Pete returned, Ringo had recovered and taken his place. The official story that Pete was fired for not being good enough was a lie they all agreed to tell. Pete's reputation was destroyed to protect the band's image. He became the punchline to a joke about failure. Meanwhile, he worked 3 jobs to pay off Ringo's medical debts, never saying a word about the truth. "They're going to find out," Ringo said to his reflection in the mirror. His hands wouldn't stop shaking. The drumsticks he'd held 1,000 times felt foreign, heavy, wrong. A knock at the door made him jump. John entered first, followed by Paul and George. They'd all seen the letter. They all knew what it meant. "We deny it," Paul said immediately. "Say the photo's fake. Look at the bloody thing," John snapped. "You can see the surgical scars. You can see Pete's face. You can see the date on the newspaper in the background." George, always the quiet one, spoke the truth they were all avoiding. "We threw Pete under the bus. We let the world think he was worthless. And he never said a word because we paid him to keep quiet," John finished. £5,000 to disappear and keep his mouth shut. Wait, you need to understand what this means for the story. Pete Best wasn't just any drummer. He'd been with the Beatles since the beginning. He'd played the Cavern Club dozens of times. He'd been part of their first recording sessions. The fans loved him, some say more than they loved John or Paul. But after that night, after the secret payment, Pete Best vanished from music entirely. The Beatles told themselves they were protecting everyone. Pete got money for his silence. Ringo got his dream. The band got their drummer. But guilt is like water. It finds every crack, seeps into everything, rots from the inside out. "Maybe we should tell the truth," Ringo said quietly. The other 3 turned on him instantly. "Tell them what?" Paul's voice was sharp. "That we've been lying for months? That our drummer is only here because the real drummer was too noble to let him die? That the Beatles are built on a lie?" "We're built on music," George corrected. "No," John said darkly. "We're built on image, and image is everything." But what happened next changed the entire trajectory of that night. 20 minutes before showtime, another letter arrived. This one wasn't a threat. It was from Pete Best himself. 3 words: "I'll be watching." Ringo's legs gave out. He collapsed into a chair, the drumsticks falling from nerveless fingers. Pete was here, in the Royal Albert Hall. The man whose life they'd destroyed to build their empire was sitting in the audience, waiting. "He's going to stand up," Ringo whispered, mid-song. "He's going to stand up and tell everyone." "He won't," Paul said, but his confidence was cracking. "How do you know?" "Because he's Pete. He's too good for revenge." John laughed bitterly. "We thought we were too good to become liars. Look how that turned out." The call came. 5 minutes to showtime. The Beatles walked toward the stage, like men approaching the gallows. They could hear the crowd, excited, innocent, unaware they were about to witness either the greatest performance or the greatest disaster in rock history. As they waited in the wings, Ringo saw him, 3rd row center. Pete Best, wearing a simple black suit, sitting perfectly still, while everyone around him buzzed with excitement. Their eyes met across the space. Pete didn't smile. He didn't frown. He just nodded. Once, "I can't do this," Ringo said. "You have to," John replied. "We all have to." They took the stage to thunderous applause. 5,000 of Britain's elite on their feet, cheering for 4 boys from Liverpool who'd conquered the world. The lights were blinding, the heat was suffocating, and in the 3rd row, Pete Best sat like a judge waiting to pass sentence. They opened with "Roll Over Beethoven." John's guitar rang out, Paul's bass thumped, George's fingers flew across the frets, and Ringo raised his sticks to begin the beat that would drive it all. But here's the moment that no one could have predicted. As Ringo brought the sticks down for the first beat, his hands cramped. A sudden violent spasm that sent the drumsticks flying from his grip. They hit the floor with a crash that cut through the music like a gunshot. The band stopped. The crowd gasped. 5,000 people turned to stare at Ringo Starr, sitting behind his drum kit with empty hands, looking like he'd seen a ghost. Because he had. In that moment, staring at Pete Best, Ringo saw the ghost of who he used to be, the dying man in a hospital bed, the drummer who'd stolen another man's life. John tried to cover, stepping to the microphone. "Technical difficulty, folks. Just a moment." But Ringo wasn't reaching for his backup sticks. He was standing up, walking away from the drums, walking toward the front of the stage, walking toward Pete. "Stop. This is where everything you think you know about the Beatles changes. I have something to say," Ringo announced, his voice carrying through the sudden silence. He didn't have a microphone, but the acoustics of the Royal Albert Hall carried his words to every corner. Paul grabbed his arm. "Don't." Ringo shook him off. "I've been living a lie. We all have." The crowd murmured, confused, concerned, captivated. John and George exchanged panicked looks. This was it. The end of the Beatles. The end of everything they'd built. 6 months ago, Ringo continued, his voice stronger now. "I was dying, and a man saved my life. He gave up everything to save me. His career, his dreams, his future. That man is sitting right there." He pointed at Pete. 5,000 heads turned. Pete Best, the failed Beatle, the cautionary tale, the punchline, sat frozen as every eye in the Royal Albert Hall found him. "His name is Pete Best," Ringo said, "and he should be sitting behind those drums, not me." The silence that followed was absolute. You could hear hearts beating. You could hear dreams shattering. You could hear the Beatles dying in real time. But then something extraordinary happened. Pete Best stood up, slowly, deliberately, every movement watched by thousands. He walked toward the stage, the crowd parting like he was Moses approaching the Red Sea. He climbed the steps. He approached Ringo, who stood trembling, tears streaming down his face. And then Pete Best did something no one expected. He hugged Ringo Starr. Not a quick embrace, a real hug, the kind that says everything words can't. The crowd remained silent, witnessing something that transcended music, transcended fame, transcended everything they thought they'd come to see. When Pete pulled back, he spoke loud enough for the front rows to hear. "You survived, that's all I wanted. You survived, and you made music. That's not theft, that's a gift." But wait, the real shock was still coming. Pete walked over to the abandoned drum kit. He sat down on the stool he'd occupied 100 times before any of them were famous. He picked up the dropped drumsticks, twirled them once in that way drummers do, and looked at the other Beatles. "One song," he said, "for old time's sake." John, Paul, and George stood frozen, unsure what to do. The crowd held its breath. The moment stretched like a wire about to snap. Then John spoke. "What song?" Pete smiled for the first time. "Love Me Do, the first one we ever recorded together." Here's what the audience didn't know about that song. Love Me Do was recorded with Pete Best on drums. The version the world knew, the version that launched the Beatles, featured Pete's rhythm, Pete's style, Pete's soul. But after he was replaced, they re-recorded it with Ringo. They erased Pete from history, note by note. Now he sat ready to play it again. In front of royalty, in front of the world, in front of the band that had betrayed him. Paul looked at John. John looked at George. George looked at Ringo, and Ringo, still crying, nodded. They played Love Me Do, but not the version the world knew. This was raw, primal, the way it was meant to be played. Pete's drums didn't just keep time. They told a story. Every beat was a heartbeat. Every crash was catharsis. The ghost of who the Beatles used to be materialized in that hall, if only for 3 minutes. The audience didn't understand what they were witnessing, but they felt it. This wasn't a performance, it was an exorcism. 4 boys and the friend they'd betrayed, playing music like it was the only truth left in a world built on lies. When the song ended, Pete stood up. He handed the drumsticks to Ringo. He said 5 words that would haunt them forever. "Now you're really a Beatle." What happened next defied every expectation. Pete walked back to his seat. He didn't storm off. He didn't make a scene. He sat down in the 3rd row and applauded for Ringo, for the Beatles, for the music that was bigger than all of them. Ringo stood, holding the drumsticks like they were made of gold. The crowd, still confused but moved by something they couldn't name, began to applaud, tentatively, at first, then stronger, then a standing ovation that shook the ancient hall. But Ringo wasn't done. He walked back to the microphone and spoke the words that would change everything. "Ladies and gentlemen, the man who just played drums is Pete Best. He's the reason the Beatles exist. He's the reason I'm alive, and he's the best drummer I've ever known." The applause exploded again, this time for Pete. He stood, waved once, and then did something incredible. He pointed at Ringo and mouthed, "Play." Now here's the part of the story that's never been told. After that night, the newspapers went crazy. The story of Pete's sacrifice, Ringo's near death, the band's deception. It should have destroyed the Beatles, but it didn't. It made them human. It made them real. The fans didn't turn away. They loved them more for their flaws, their guilt, their attempt at redemption. Pete Best was offered record deals, TV appearances, a chance to reclaim his place in music history. He turned them all down. He opened a small music school in Liverpool, teaching drums to kids who couldn't afford lessons. He never gave another interview about the Beatles. He never wrote a tell-all book. He never cashed in on his pain. But every year, on the anniversary of that night at the Royal Albert Hall, a package would arrive at Pete's school, no return address. Inside, enough money to keep the school running for another year, and a note, same handwriting every time. For the kids, the Beatles continued their ascension to become the biggest band in history. But they were different after that night. Humbler, kinder, more grateful. They knew they were living on borrowed time, playing with borrowed talent, succeeding on the sacrifice of someone they'd wronged. Here's what really matters about this story. Years later, in 1970, when the Beatles broke up, journalists asked each member about their biggest regret. John talked about Yoko. Paul mentioned business disputes. George discussed creative differences. But Ringo's answer was different. "My biggest regret he said, is that it took me so long to tell the truth about Pete. We could have been honest from the start. The fans would have understood. Pete deserved better. We all did. But there's one final twist to this story that changes everything. In 1980, after John's death, his estate released a collection of unreleased recordings. Among them was a session from December 1963, 3 months after the Royal Albert Hall incident. It featured all 4 Beatles and Pete Best on drums. They'd been meeting in secret, recording together. 5 friends making music with no contracts, no pressure, no lies, just the pure joy that had brought them together in the first place. 17 songs, the best music the Beatles ever made, and it was never meant to be released. The recordings were labeled with a single word, forgiveness. Paul, George, and Ringo agreed to release them, with all proceeds going to Pete's music school. The album went to #1 in 27 countries. Pete Best finally got his name on a Beatles album, not as the drummer they fired, but as the friend they found again. At the release party, a journalist asked Pete if he regretted saving Ringo's life, given everything that happened after. Pete's answer was simple. I saved Richard Starkey. He became Ringo's star. The world got the Beatles. Kids got their heroes. Music got its revolution. What's to regret? But they erased you from history. Pete smiled. No, they gave me something better. They gave me purpose. Every kid I teach, every life I touch, that's my legacy. The Beatles made millions of people happy. I made one person alive. Both matter. The truth about that night at the Royal Albert Hall is this. When Ringo's drumsticks hit the floor, it wasn't an accident. His body rebelled against the lie. His hands refused to play another note built on deception. Sometimes our bodies know the truth before our minds accept it. The empty drum kit became a symbol, not of absence, but of presence. Pete's presence, the ghost of integrity, haunting every beat. The reminder that success built on someone else's sacrifice is never really success at all. The Beatles went on to change the world, but they were changed first. In that moment, when the drumsticks fell, when the truth demanded its voice, when Pete Best proved that the best revenge isn't revenge at all, it's grace. Some say Ringo was never as good a drummer after that night. That's not true. He was better, because he played every beat, knowing what it cost, knowing who paid for it, knowing that every rhythm was a debt he could never fully repay. That's the real story of the empty drum kit. The night the Beatles faced their original sin. The night Pete Best became the 5th Beatle, not by playing with them, but by forgiving them. The night 5,000 people at the Royal Albert Hall witnessed something bigger than music. They witnessed redemption. The drumsticks that fell that night are now in Pete's music school, framed on the wall with a plaque that reads, "Sometimes we have to fall before we can rise. Sometimes we have to break before we can heal. Sometimes the music stops so the truth can speak." And below that, in Ringo's handwriting, "To Pete, who saved my life twice, once from death, once from living a lie." The empty drum kit. 3 words that changed everything. Because sometimes what's missing matters more than what's there. Sometimes absence speaks louder than presence. Sometimes the greatest music is the silence between the notes, where truth lives, where ghosts dance, where 4 boys from Liverpool learned that fame without honor is just noise. But the most beautiful part? Pete Best is still alive, still teaching, still refusing to profit from his pain, still proving that the best people aren't always the most famous, that history is written by the winners, but truth is preserved by the brave. Every time you hear the Beatles, remember the empty drum kit. Remember the man who gave up everything and asked for nothing in return. Remember that behind every great story is a secret, and behind every secret is a sacrifice, and behind every sacrifice is a choice to forgive or forever hold the wound. Pete Best chose forgiveness, and in doing so, he saved the Beatles twice, once from obscurity, and once from themselves.